Hello guys, today we're going to discuss about the research paper called Houdini's Escape, Breaking the Resource Reign of Linux Control Groups. This has been presented by myself, Anirudh Kulkarni, and my colleagues Jalad Sharma and Tanay Ghosh. Here are the authors of the paper. Jing Gao from University of Memphis, Zhangzhu Gu from IBM Research, Zhengfa Li as an independent researcher, Hani Zhenzhum, IBM Research, and Kong Wang, Old Dominion University. The scope of our presentation for the paper are motivation and overview of the C groups, which is also known as the control groups, exploiting strategies, the below said case studies, and in the end, the conclusion.
Hello, my name is Tana, and I'm here to explain the importance of C groups in container technology. Container technology has wide use in the cloud, such as microservice architecture, serverless computing, edge computing. Previously, in cloud technologies, VMs were extensively used, but VMs had some issues which led to wastage of resources. Uh, the elimination of additional abstraction layers from the VMs led to better resource utilization and improved efficiency in case of container technology. Containers depend on C groups for resource management and control to prevent one container from draining systems resources of the host. Exploiting the resource management mechanism in C groups impact the application and services that use containers. Malicious containers can greatly exhaust the host's resources, launch multiple attacks, example denial of service attacks, etc. Such risks needs to be identified to prevent disruption in cloud services. What are C groups? In the Linux kernel, C groups allow you to allocate resources such as CPU time, system memory, network bandwidth, or combination of these among user-defined groups of processes running on a system. In the diagram below, we can see that the RAM, the CPU, the bandwidth, and I/O has been divided and allocated to a particular C group. C groups manage resource allocation by partitioning groups of process into hierarchical groups with controlled behavior. All child processes inherit certain attributes from their parents and are controlled by the same mechanism. The mechanism rely on different resource controllers to limit, account for, and isolate various types of system resources. Resource limits on individual containers are applied and prevent a single container from draining host resources. The C groups are organized in a hierarchical structure where a set of C groups are managed in a tree. There are four controllers used by C groups. That is, CPU controller makes the CPU as a manageable resource. CPU set controller provides a mechanism for constraining a set of tasks to specific CPUs and a memory node. Block IO controller controls and limits access to specified block devices by applying IO control. PID controller is used to set a certain limit on the number of tasks of a container. Let's talk about exploiting strategies. We'll be looking at four exploiting strategies for escaping resource control of C group mechanism. Exploiting upcalls from kernel, delegating workloads to kernel threads, exploiting service processes, and exploiting interrupt context. Let's briefly look at the exploiting upcalls from kernel strategy. All kernel threads are attached to the root C group since a kernel thread is created by the kernel. All processes created through fork or clone by kernel threads are also attached to the same C group, the root C group, as their parents. As a result, a process inside one C group can exploit kernel threads as proxies to spawn new processes and thus escape the control of the C groups. All workloads running on a newly created process will not be limited by C group subsystems and thus break the resource of the control. Let's look at the delegating workloads to the kernel threads strategy. All kernel threads are attached to the root C group. The resources consumed by the workloads will be accounted to the target kernel thread instead of the initiating user space process. The Linux kernel runs multiple kernel threads handling various kernel functions and running kernel code in the process context, such as kthread, which is the kernel thread daemon to create other kernel threads, kworker, which is introduced to handle work queue, tasks, etc. If a process can force kernel threads to run delegated workloads, the corresponding consumed resource will not be limited by C groups. Exploiting service processes. A Linux server runs multiple system processes for different purposes such as process management, system information logging, and debugging. Many user space processes serve as the dependencies for other processes and run simultaneously to support these processes. If a user process can generate kernel workloads on processes that depend on it, the consumed resources will not be charged to the initiating process. Exploiting interrupt context. The cgroup mechanism only calculates the resources consumed in the process context. Linux kernel services interrupts in two parts: top half, that is hardware interrupts; bottom half, that is software interrupts. When executing an interrupt handler on the bottom half, the kernel is running in the software interrupt context. Thus, it will not charge any process for the system resources. All resources consumed in the system interrupt context will not consume any quotas of the raised process. The execution of the soft IRQs will preempt any workloads on the current process and all processes will be delayed. If the workloads to the handle soft IRQs are too heavy, the kernel will offload them to the kernel thread ksoft IRQ. Ksoft IRQ is a one thread per CPU kernel thread and runs at the default process priority. If process is able to raise large amount of software interrupts, the kernel will have to spend resources on handling soft IRQs in the interrupt context, in the process context of the soft IRQ. Now we'll take a deeper look at the exploiting strategies by seeing the case studies.
Hello friends, my name is Jalal Sharma. As we discussed about a potential threat which can exploit the C groups. Now we're gonna discuss like how this C groups we can exploit, how we can exploit the C groups, and how we can get can these C groups can affect the other container, and the same container can get advantage over the other container. Like they can slow down the performance of other container, gain unfair advantages on the other container. This is including like CPU time, system memory, block IO bandwidth, and pin to the specific cores. So these are the challenges which we're gonna discuss in the our next slides. Uh, for testing these scenarios, we have like a local system, a local test bench, which is Dell XPS server of Intel i7 processor of 16 gigs of RAM and SATA hard drive with 7200 of RPM, and we have Ubuntu Linux kernel 18.06 version. And for the EC2, we have E5266 36 into 2.9 gigahertz of core and 64 gigs of RAM and SSD of 1000 IOPS and 10,000 megabyte of network card with the Ubuntu 18.06. So these are the description of server, and in our following are the case studies which are like we'll see how exception handling can be exploit C groups. The same way we're gonna see in the data synchronization how they can exploit the C groups and how they can get advantage over other C groups. Service Gerald, which we discussed detailed how these services can be used uh, for the like this is like service journal are the logging services which keep the logs and how this can be exploited, container engines and software handling. Exception handling. So in exception handling, when an exception is raised by any container, it will be handled by a kernel and will not be charged. With this, a loss of 85 to 95% can be seen on the other containers. If a container keep raising an exception, then it will be scheduled by the kernel to the all CPU cores for the load balancing, and which is not in the container, which is on the kernel system. So it is charged, it is not charged on the container, it goes to the kernel. A port is a core dump function for debugging. So like whenever an exception raised, it called the port, and which invoked by the kernel for exception and will not be charged. A port will schedule to all the core respective of the C group. So suppose an exception is raised by a malicious container, and there are three other containers which are sharing the resource. So it will be uh, the port will schedule the exception to all those three cores also. So to test these attacks, our author has decided to one container, a process where a process in a one container which can raise continue exceptions like divided by zero or any other exception. So our user write a code for divided by zero exception in the one container, and which is utilizing only 7.4% of the core. But in actual, the exception by the kernel is sent to all the cores. In our local test bed, we have the 12 cores, and one is assigned to our user container, and which is charged for only 7.4% of 7.4%. But in actual, it is using 1200%. So that's the change in our local testbed we are seeing. The same on the EC2 server is uh, our process which is running on our user container is charging only 22.5%, but actually it's running on all 36 cores, which is utilizing 3600% of the core. So this is the problem, or this by this we can exploit by the other containers or the resources of the our system, and it will be charged only 7.4% local test bed or 22.75% in our EC2 server. This is for the just one test. It can vary, but by this we can prove that our C groups can be exploited. When a multiple container run on the same core, they compete for the CPU resources. For that, Linux system have a CFS system, which ensure the complete fairness to all the containers. It scheduled a time slot or a number of time period or a percentage of resource which they can use to the each container. But suppose a malicious container which can generate the extra workload outside its own CPU group, so the CPU or our kernel system has to assign some workload to that process also. So here our user did uh, create two containers. One is a victim and another is a malicious container. In a victim container, it's just run the normal workload, but in the malicious container, what it will do, it will create a exception handling mechanism to generate outside workload outside C groups. It doesn't affect the malicious container. It's run normal, but if we see the output of the victim container, its performance significantly reduced by 95% on both CPU and memory on our local test bed, and the IO performance by 17%. And if we talk about the EC2 server, the number of a number is around 85% for the CPU and memory performance and 82% on the IO performance. This is reasonable since the erasing exception cause huge amount of user space code dump application that compete for CPU cycles with the victim container. We further change the core affinity of malicious container by pinning the container on a different core. Although the malicious container is no longer computing CPU resources on the same core with the victim. It still shows similar result on the performance of a victim. The reason is that the main competitor of a CPU resource is not the malicious container, but those triggered core dump applications. This result demonstrates that a malicious tenant can easily utilize a container to significantly reduce the performance of all the other containers on the same host and lower the quality of service of the service vendor and thus potentially cause huge financial loss with a little cost. So we have discussed one of our case studies on exception handling, how it can exploit C groups and CPU resources and affect the other containers sharing the same host on the same host or competing for the cores or the memory or input output. Now we're going to discuss about data synchronization, how it affect the other C group and how it can be exploited. Now we're going to see about how we can exploit a write-back mechanism for the disk data synchronization. When CPU write in a cache only at the time of update. So whenever the caches are cleared, it again write the data from the cache to the memory or the disk. So this create a huge amount of time. Like writing in a cache is easy, it's faster, but writing in a disk is a slower compared to writing in a cache. Here we are gonna exploit this. If a container finds a way to remove cache content of other container, it can be exploited them. Suppose at the same we two container are running on a host, and one container run a program to clear the cache continuously and running its a small process and it's running its own process also. So it can continue clear the cache which is other container is using at the same time, and that cache can be utilized for the malicious container. But on the same time, the other container which is writing its data in the cache has to do a lot more work until the malicious container is finishes work. So this can be exploited over here. The periodical writebacks also, or it can cause the periodical writebacks or insufficient memory problem. Suppose insufficient memory because it will write all the data or the memory will be full because of the periodical writebacks or data evicted from the cache gonna be written in the memory. So it can cause that problem if we have a lower or like weak IO throughput. In data synchronization, we're gonna talk about sync function, the block IO input output C groups, uh, input output based denial of service attack, resource freeing attack, and covert channels. Sync replaces all the dirty pages from the cache and write back to the disk. Sync allow a process to write back all the dirty buffer to the disk. Any IO operations have to wait for the flushing. Sometimes it is even worse. The dirty buffer generated by other process might belong to another container. Will also be forced to write back to the disk. If there are IO operation on other co-resident container, the sync will write back all the dirty pages. However, once we run another container with some simple write operation, the sync lead to a huge amount of CPU wait time, which is generated by the combination of sync and the write operations. The CPU wait time is used to indicate the time consumed for IO waiting and can still be used by other workloads. However, the performance of a particular workload running on other container is significantly impacted. Block IO BLK IOC groups. These C groups are used to apply controls on the container running sync. A Docker only support limiting IO throughput by weight. But if a kernel can set an upper limit, So suppose a particular amount of resource is only IO operation is given only to particular container, but if we are able to exploit the kernel, it can set the upper limit. A write-back workload triggered by sync are handled in a kernel thread, and no IO workload is charged to the container invoking the sync. So suppose as all the write-back workload are triggered by sync are handled in the kernel thread, and which is not part of the container. So any write-back operation generated by the kernel is not charged in a container C group. So it can affect the usage of other container, or it can cause loss of money to the service provider who is providing a container facility to that particular user. In our IO based denial of service attack, we again have two containers. One is malicious container and other is the victim container. The one container, the malicious container, will keep invoking system-wide writebacks regardless of whether the process that issued IO is inside the container or not. And all the other services have to wait until the writeback finish. Means all the other containers inside the system, inside the host have to wait, because that particular container is using all the IO. Run one container to call sync without any IO operation, and other victim container to perform the IO operations. So by this, suppose with the workload as like a small workload, a malicious container is issuing input output. That will cause a huge amount of IO operations, but for the victim container, it has to keep wait until the other IO works, or like the container, the malicious container finishes. It's all the IO works, input output works. The result of IO based attack on the container, on the victim container, it can affect the sequential read on the local testbed to 38%, and on the EC2 instance 61%. The same way, the sequential write is around negligible, around to 2%, and the sequential write is 13.7%. The random read is 36% on local testbed, and in the EC2 server 67.7%. The effect on the EC2 server is low because it has a much higher configuration, but on the local testbed it has a very high effect. Suppose if a system or a cloud server have a weak IO or a weak performing IO, it can affect that servers with an enormous amount, or it can almost kill the IO operation. Now we are talking about the another attack which we can by which we can exploit the C groups. The resource freeing attacks, RFA. Here the goal is to free up the important resource or the resources used by the other container by running a simple lightweight program called helper to free the resources used by the victim container so that the beneficiary can gain more resources. The helper program only consumes a few system resources, thus it almost has no impact on the beneficiary, but can significantly impact the workload running on the victim container. For example, in a malicious container, a beneficiary program can run CPU-intensive workload and compete for the CPU resource with the victim container on the same CPU core. The victim container run an IO-intensive workload, so the CPU active is bound with the frequency of IO operation. The more IO operation make the victim container consume more CPU cycle to handle the request. Then the malicious one run the helper program to call the sync periodically, trigger writebacks, and reduce the IO activities of victim. As a result, the CPU usage of a victim container is reduced, and the malicious one can gain more CPU resources. In the experiment, the author did this by running two containers on the same core. In the victim container, author stimulate a web crawler case where the container constantly write back a web page into a new file. The author measured the CPU and the memory performance of a malicious container by using sysbench. And the result we can see in the next figure. The figure shows the result of resource freeing attack. First, author test with no competition, like running both victim and malicious container on a different cores. So by this we can see the malicious container is working independently have 632, and when we run both on the same core without any helper program, we have the 297 or event per second in CPU for the malicious the container we have. But when we run a helper program with the malicious and victim container both, the malicious container have 613 event per second in the CPU, which is almost equal to the original without any competition. The same way it happened in the EC2 instance also, and the same we can see in the memory in the megabytes. The covert channels are timing based. Here we demonstrate the inefficiencies in C group could also be exploited by malicious attacker to build timing based covert channel across the different cores. Idea is to leverage the performance differences occurred by the disk data synchronization. We measure the timing of writing 10 file in a one container while running a sync in another container on another core. We repeat the experiment for the 100th time and present the distribution of a required in the figure. We can observe the obvious timing difference for operating the file between the running sync and without running sync. We build the proof of concept channel by leveraging the performance differences and are able to transfer the data with a read bit of 2 bits per second with an error of 2%. Now we have seen the inefficiencies or exploitation of C groups by exception handling and data synchronization error. Now we're gonna see the journal services, which is a logging services in a Linux kernel system, and now we're gonna see how we can exploit it. In the journal system process, we're gonna see a little bit about journal service and analysis and about the su command by which we can switch the user and how it's affect the process of other C groups and give the advantage in the local or the system running su command or how the exceptions came in, how we can add a user group or add new user or new group, which also affect the C groups and the denial of service attack and residual effects. Joral services provide a system to collect logging data, including kernel log message and system log message. These are the services of a kernel. So whenever a system switch a user or from a container to a kernel system or something like that, these are logged by Joral services. And this also can affect a CPU utilization of 5 to 20% and input output throughput to 2 megabytes per second, and which is not charged to the C groups. Many functionalities are maintained by operating system and not charged on the C groups, and journal services are belong to one of them. Many system processes inside the container are ignored because when they logged in, they immediately switch to the kernel mode or the root user by su command, and they are not charged. Switch user command. Uh, SU command By SU command, we can switch the ownership of a user to the root user, which is an administrator. By the way, like if you are using a Windows system, the actions of switching user are recorded in the journals by the journal services. A user inside a container will have the full privileges on a container, but will have less privileges or no privileges on the host system. But that user can switch to the root user by using SU command and can have full privileges on the system and the other container also. And these things are recorded by the journal services. And adding a user and adding a group will also be logged by a journal services. And these logging services caused a CPU utilization and memory utilization. So, and this utilization of journal services by SU command is not charged on C groups. As mentioned previously, the kernel is unable to distinguish the context of raised exception. Thus, the crash information caused by exception inside a container will also trigger a logging activities of the system process on the host. Uh, all the above workload will be trigger a significant amount of event logging in the journal services. A author set one container with a one CPU core computing capacity to keep invoking above commands in our local test bed. And the observation comes a constant 3.5% of CPU utilization on a journal and 2.5% CPU utilization of audit and 1% CPU utilization of K audit. These are the services used to log. In a EC2 server, the number is much bigger due to better I/O performance. We observe an average CPU utilization about 20%. We also find that an average I/O throughput is around 2 megabytes per second on a journal process. While the I/O throughput is a 0 in our container, this number will increase if we assign more computing resource to the container. The logging activities in a journal will generate a non-negligible amount of I/O operations, which lead to resource competition with the other containers. To measure the consequences, the author run two containers on a different cores of a host. In a malicious container, author keeps switching the user and quitting current user. In the victim container, author run the same benchmark as the data synchronization. By the overall, the result was the system-wide performance degradation. The attack by abusing Jonald will be more effective in a server with a poor I/O performance. As in a example of local test bed. As mentioned before, it can cause more than 2 megabytes of I/O throughput in a Jonald process. Author observed it can still slow down other container in EC2 dedicated server with 1000 IOPS throughput of about 15 megabytes. In a dedicated server with a default configuration, example 400 IOPS with a throughput of about 6 megabytes per second, author observed more obvious result. Residual effects. The server with a poor I/O performance might surpass I/O ability of the server writing workloads. A system create a huge queue of logging events. Suppose if by using su command, a malicious container keep uh, uh, keep switching the user from root or some different user to user and continue to do it. It can generate a huge queue of logging event. So the other container is sharing that IO resource. They have to wait until the logging is finished. Sometimes the container are stopped, but the system continue until the journal finishes the logging write to the disk. So till now we have seen the exception handling part in the case studies, data synchronization, and how journal service affect the utilization of CPU and are not charged, and how we can exploit the data synchronization and can gain advantage over the other container, and by exception handling also how it can be lead to more CPU utilization, but is not charged to the malicious container. Now we're gonna talk about the container engine and how we can exploit it. Fork container is to exploit the container engine by triggering extra workload on both kernel thread, example kvoke, and the container engine, which is required to run on the host to support and manage container instance. Particularly, the container engine runs as a privileged daemon on system, and thus it is attached to different C groups as a container instance. The C groups on a container instance will not be able to control the consumed resources on the engine. We find that the container can increase the resource consumption about 3 times, which we're gonna see in the detailed analysis and how different kind of attacks works. Docker container engine and its C group hierarchy. Docker creates a Docker C group containing all the container instances. Container are identified by its ID. All the workload running inside the container will be charged to the container C group, theoretically or identically. A Docker daemon process run in the background handling the management of a Docker images. The Docker engine communicate with the container daemon to further use running container for running the containers. The Docker process has multiple child process each container instance. Those processes are attached to default cgroups for all system services. The Docker control and manages Docker through CLI command line interface, which interact with the Docker daemon and REST API. The Docker CLI provides interface for a user to create or execute a container. It also provides multiple commands to set a configuration or on resource limitation related to underlying control C group. Similar to Docker engine process, the Docker CLI does not belong to the container C groups either, and it's not charged. It is fairly easy to exploit the container engine to break the control of a C group. Uh, the data first passes through the CLI process and the container daemon and reaches the TTY driver for further processing. Specifically, the data sent to the L disk means whenever data is processed, it processed by the CLI in the container daemon and reach the TTY driver for further processing, and then it's sent to the L disk. And the L disk connect the high-level generic interface with a low-level device driver in a terminal system. Then the data is flushed to L disk by executing worker queue in a key worker kernel thread. As a result, all the workload on the kernel thread and all container engine process will not be charged to the container instance. The author measured the workload generated in a container engine by repeatedly showing all the loaded modules in the host in the terminal and illustrate the result in a figure. Again, the utilization of the container is limited to 1 core. Overall, with the 1 core computing power of 100%, the container can cause around about 300% of workload on the host by abusing the Docker engine process. And the attacker is able to reduce the CPU and the memory performance by 15%. Now we have finished exception handling, data synchronization, service journal, and container engine exploitation, and how we can abuse them. And now we're gonna see how software handling can affect CPU utilization and memory utilization and IO throughput, and how it can affect the victim container performance. The current kernel system define 11 type of software. Particularly, it is common for hardware interrupt handler to raise the software. Handling software consumes CPU resource on the process of context of kernel thread or interrupt context. So they are not charged in C groups. Net software. Interrupt will be raised once the NIC network interface card finishes the packet transmission, and software are responsible for moving packet between the driver buffer and networking stack. Uh, uh, the overhead raised by the software is negligible when the traffic bandwidth is limited. So here overheads are the information attached with the packet to send a packet and necessary information to send packet from one place to another, which can raise around 1% of order rate, and which can equal to 1 gigabyte per second of network traffic. We find that the overhead occurred by the network traffic will be greatly amplified by a firewall system on the server. The IP table built on the top of NetFilter provide management layer for adding and deleting packet filters rules. The NetFilter hook packet between the network driver and network stack. All networking packets are first inspected by filtering rules, then forwarded to for further action. Example: forwarding discarding processing by the network stack. As a result, the process of a networking traffic under the IP table is handled in the software context, and thus will not be charged on the container generating or receiving the traffic. Once there is a considerable number of rules, and overhead will not be negligible. For testing this, our author has on our local testbed with a capacity of 100 megabits and networking traffic about 20 to 30 megabits, which is significantly smaller than the GBPS level, as well as uh, the author can clearly see significant overhead occurred by handling network traffic and strongly correlate to the number of rules. When a number of rules reach 5000, the CPU will waste a huge amount of time on processing software, around 16%, and no charge to the initiated network traffic. Once the rules of our firewalls or network traffic reach to 10,000, the server and the overhead is about 40%, and the most of them are concentrated on single core. On the EC2 server has a much powerful NIC with a 10,000 megabits capacity and much higher bandwidth compared with upper local test bed. The overhead is slightly smaller compared with the local test bed. With the networking traffic of 300 megabits, the traffic can still waste a negligible amount of CPU cycle. The handling of software interrupt will either preempt the current work or consume CPU cycle in a kernel thread. As a result, all other workload on the same core will be delayed. In the figure, we can see by increasing number of rules in our IP tables, or the increasing number of percent in the CPU network uses in a byte in both EC2 server and the local test bed both. So when you see the 10,000 rule, it in the local test bed, it almost surpasses 40% of system uses, and in the EC2 when it has a much better configuration, so it also surpasses around 17 to 18%, something like that.
In order to come to a conclusion, the paper demonstrates the inherited control groups or the C groups confinement via process creation that does not always guarantee consistent and fair resource accounting. The paper generates out-of-band workloads via processes deassociated from their original C groups. The paper demonstrates also that a container can amplify its workloads as much as 200 times above its limit and reduce the performance of other containers by 95%. Please find the references as shown here. Thank you all for tuning in to us. We hope you had a fun learning experience. I hope you guys are safe and sound, and take care. Have a great time ahead. Thank you.